are two readings this morning, both from the New Testament. And the first one is from the book of John, the Gospel of John, chapter 14, and that's on page 901 in your church Bibles. And I'm reading from chapter 14, verses 1 to 7. This is the Gospel of John, and it's Jesus who is speaking at the start here. Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. And you know the way I am going. Thomas said to him, Lord, we do not know where you are going. How can we know the way? Jesus said to him, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you had known me, you would have known my Father also. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. This is the word of the Lord. The second reading is from the last book in the Bible, from Revelation. It's on page 1041, if you want to follow it. And it's chapter 21, and I'll be reading the first 7 verses. So first we had the Gospel of John, now we've got the Revelation of John. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people. And God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. And he who was seated on the throne said, Behold, I am making all things new. Also, he said, Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true. And he said to me, It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give from the spring of the water of life without payment. The one who conquers will have this heritage, and I will be his God and he will be my son. But as for the cowardly, the faithless, the detestable, as for murderers, the sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars, their portion will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks very much, Michael. It would be a great help to me if you can keep that Bible passage open, the Revelation passage. That's where we're going to be basing ourselves this morning. I began last week by saying the Bible is a very short book, which it is if you consider all the things that God could have put in it and chose not to. To keep it from being enormous, God only put in the things that we must know if we're going to trust in Jesus and keep going with him to the end. So if it's in the Bible, it's essential for us today. And last week we saw how that's true about hell. How does hell help us as Christians today? This morning we're asking the same question about heaven. How does heaven help us? Now that might seem like a much easier question to answer, much nicer topic to talk about. But I think that Bible-believing Christians might even be more confused about heaven than we are about hell. And if we are thinking about heaven wrongly, it's not going to be able to help us rightly today. So would you have a look with me at verses 1 to 2 as we begin? verses 1 to 2 of Revelation 21. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. So the first problem we have when we think about heaven is that normally we're not actually thinking about heaven at all. Heaven exists right now. It's the place where Christians who die go to be with Jesus. Heaven is spiritual and not physical. Our spirits go there, our bodies don't. They stay here and rot in the ground. Heaven is also temporary. Heaven is like the members' lounge, an airport where you go for a drink before you head off on your holiday. It's a happy place, exciting, lots of anticipation, but it's a temporary place. It's a waiting room for what's really to come. That's what verse 1 says. It says, the first heaven, the one that exists now, and the first earth, where you're sitting now, had passed away. They don't last. They're going. God is making a new heaven and a new earth. And in verse 2, and this is really important to see, in verse 2, when Jesus returns, he joins the new heaven and the new earth together as the new Jerusalem comes down out of heaven from God onto the new earth. Heaven and earth, both made new, both joined together at the end. That is our final destination, that newness. And if we call that new thing heaven, well, that's a common word for it, but it's kind of confusing because heaven means something else. Heaven means the waiting room. And we want to talk about the final destination. So we'll use the phrase, the new creation, instead. It's a phrase that we often use about the final place where we're going to be, not heaven, but new heaven and new earth joined together in the new creation. And what we're going to see first is that that new creation is physical. It's physical. It's not floating around on a cloud, strumming a harp, singing Kumbaya. It's physical. All the language in these chapters at the end of the Bible are filled with physicality. There's talk of a city with walls and gates, of people who eat and drink. But more than what we see in Revelation, we know that the new creation is physical because it's already begun. Now, in Revelation, it's all future, isn't it? God will do this in the future, and that's true. But he has actually started it in one man. It's begun already in the person of Jesus. So Christians who die go to heaven, the waiting room, and wait there for their new bodies in the new creation. But Jesus has his new body already. He got his early. He's allowed to. He's the Son of God. His resurrection has already happened, and his new creation body that he's already got is physical. We see that in the Bible. Now, it's different from your body and mine today. Jesus, when he rose, could walk through locked doors. He could appear and disappear just like that. But it is nonetheless properly physical. He was a man you could smell and touch, a man who ate fish and had barbecues on the beach with his friends. And the new creation is like him. He's got it already. We're all going to catch up later. The new creation is like Jesus, physical, not floaty. It's like Jesus in another important way as well. It's like Jesus in that it is different from today, but connected to today. Now, if you're going to understand what we're saying from Revelation this morning, this is what you've got to get a hold of. All right? That the new creation is different from today, but connected to. Different from, connected to. Those two things get together. So let's think about Jesus first. How is that true of him? Well, his new body could do new stuff. Like I said, he could walk through locked doors. He could appear and disappear at will. But his new body still bore the scars of the cross, didn't it? Remember, Thomas said, I won't believe until I can put my hand in the holes in his side and wrists. Well, he could, and he did, because Jesus' new body was connected to his old body. What his old body had gone through, his new body bore. Now, that same idea of different but connected to now can be seen in verse 2 as well. It's not just true of Jesus, it's true of the new creation. Verse 2 is actually talking about you and me. Sounds like it's talking about a city. doesn't it? But it's actually talking about you and me. God's people there are described as the holy city, the New Jerusalem. A New Jerusalem. Like, you don't use that language unless you're trying to make a connection to the old Jerusalem. Otherwise, you'd come up with a different name for the city. The point of that language is to say God's people are connected to his historic dealings with his people, the old Jerusalem where God dwelt in the middle of his people in the temple. But we're different from it because now it's going to be face-to-face living, an international gathering, living forever with the Lord Jesus. Different from now, but connected to now. New Jerusalem, connected to old Jerusalem, but different. If this is all a little bit confusing, then Paul in the Bible gives us the best illustration I know of this idea, of how today is connected to the future, but different from it. He is answering the question in 1 Corinthians 15, how are the dead raised? With what kind of body do we come? Maybe that's your question too. All this talk of new bodies, well, what are they going to be like? That's the question that Paul was asked. He says this. He says, okay, think of a seed and the plant that grows from it. Your body now is the seed. Your new creation body is the plant. Those two things are deeply connected. You can't have one without the other. It's the seed that grows into the plant. And in one sense, all that the plant is contained within that seed, and yet they look and behave very differently. Plants and seeds look and behave very differently. Well, Paul says it'll be that way with our resurrection bodies, deeply connected to your body today, but also very different from it. And Revelation says that's also true for the whole creation, the whole new creation, connected to the world now, but also different from it. Seeing all of this is supposed to help us today. Some people feel particularly drawn to seeking experiences in life. I've got a friend who's not a Christian, and this was his motto when he was younger. He would never say no to any new experience. If he hadn't done it before, he was up for it, because he wanted to kind of taste, get a sense of whatever was out there while he could. And we see this, there's an industry around it now, isn't there? Red letter days, trips of a lifetime, bucket lists, 10 things I've got to do before I die. Friends, if you belong to Jesus by faith, your life is not a bucket. Your life is not a bucket. It's not a limited container into which you've got to cram as many experiences as you can now before you kick the bucket and you've lost your chance. You're not a bucket if you're a Christian. You're a pipe. Your life now is a pipe that leads into a bottomless ocean where you will have eternity to explore God's perfected new creation. So you don't have to see the Grand Canyon before you die if you believe in Jesus. You've got forever to see the perfected version of it as many times as you want. Jesus puts the same idea this way. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. He's saying your life now is connected to your eternity. You can live now in such a way that you will be glad you did it that way forever. Or you can live in a way today that feels nice right now, but is barren eternally. Friends, if you know Jesus, you do not have to live for experiences. You are free to live for him. Free to live for Christ. The new creation is physical, and you've got an eternity to explore it in all its glory. You don't have to live that way now. Second, the new creation is wonderful. The new creation is wonderful. Have a look at verse 4. God will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. If you've been around church for a while, then I suppose those words are quite familiar to you. Perhaps if you're newer to Christian things, it's a new idea. But let's just all pause and let the beauty of that promise sink in this morning. No more death, mourning, crying, pain. No more suffering. This morning, I'm confident to say there are many of us here who are facing suffering that feels like it is just clobbering us right now. Suffering that feels like it's dominating our days, coloring our mood, shaping our lives, too big to get out from underneath. Suffering can do all of that to us. Suffering can do horrible things to us today, but one thing suffering cannot do to God's children, it cannot last. It can't do it. Can't last. Now, that truth does not make our suffering disappear. It does not make our suffering unimportant, an insignificant, tiny little detail. No, it matters what you're going through. It will not stop your suffering hurting right now. But I wonder, can you see how radically it can change your relationship to your suffering this morning? Because this truth means, if you like, you can speak to your suffering, almost picture it with a face. You can look it in the face and say, suffering, right now, you are overwhelming. I can be honest to you and say, right now, you are on top of me. But suffering, all you've got is right now. This is your moment in the sun. All you've got is right now. I've got forever, and you're not going to be there. Because of Jesus, I'm going to be okay. But there's more wonder in the new creation than just the absence of suffering. Sin is absent too. Did you see that? It's why verse 8 appears in this description of all the good stuff. Why add in the negative bit in verse 8? The same idea that we saw last week when we thought about hell in chapter 20. Well, verse 8 is here because it's underlining for us that sin and those who stick with sin will be gone. God is getting rid of anything that could spoil the new creation. It could turn it sour halfway through. Of course, if God lets me in, then I'll turn it sour halfway through. I would spoil the new creation if he let me in. Living with me is no taste of heaven, I can assure you. But in the new creation, God is driving sin out of us as well. You and I will be perfected. His children will be made beautiful. Did you notice how we get described in verse 2? I said verse 2 is talking about us, God's people. We're called a city. We're called something else as well, aren't we? Verse 2, we are going to be prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. In other words, God is going to make you and me beautiful, inside and out, ready for glory, fit for Jesus. He's even using our suffering to do it in part. And that means nothing. No Satan, no one else, not even you or me, will be able ever to spoil this new creation. That makes it wonderful and guarantees the wonder forever. The new creation is wonderful. Third, the new creation is together. At the heart of the imagery in chapter 21, if we carried on reading, you'd hear it for longer. At the heart of the imagery in this chapter is the New Jerusalem, a city, the New Jerusalem. And cities are full of people. When John describes this vision of the new creation, he's not describing that kind of image that we sometimes have in our minds of a kind of a lone person wandering through a meadow with lovely weather. You know, the kind of thing you get at the end of the film Gladiator, where Russell Crowe is walking through the cornfields with his hands like that. There's none of that here. It's a city. It's bustling. It's busy. It's filled with people, because that's what the new creation will be like. Islam takes a very different view as well, doesn't it? Islam has a very different view of what it would call paradise. Islam thinks of paradise in very individualistic terms. It's all about me and my tastes being met, almost like an eternity with a VR headset on, in my own tailor-made private world of pleasure. Christianity is very different because our God is very different. Allah is a loner, cut off from humanity. The real God, the Christian God, is Trinity, Father, Son, Spirit, as we were thinking about this morning already. One God in three persons, perfectly united in love. This God, the real God, our God, he is relational down to his very core. This is why it's such a universal truth that humanity values relationships almost more than anything else. You go anywhere in the world and it's relationships that matter most to people. This is why. Because of what our God is like. We're made in his image. Of course they matter to us. And it's also why the new creation will be full of them, full of relationships. Well, that's fine for then, but how does it help us today? This whole teaching is supposed to help us today. How does it do that? Remember what Jesus said. Lay up treasure for yourselves in heaven. That means invest now in what will still matter then. And one big thing that will still matter then is your relationships with God's people. You're going to be part of the new city filled with Christians, including the people sitting in this room now. Now listen, because this life is connected to the new creation, seed, plant, that connection is strong, this life is connected to your life in the new creation, that means everything you do now matters for eternity, echoes through eternity. There's nothing that you can do that doesn't have some kind of impact in eternity if you're a believer in Jesus. But, although everything matters, only certain things carry over directly from this life into the one to come. The number of those things that carry over directly is relatively small, and church is one of them. Church is one of those few things that you can do now that will absolutely carry over directly forever. Friends, the battle to make church and church family a priority is constant. It is hard. Work, tiredness, non-Christian family and friends with different priorities on Sundays, kids' education, kids' sport, kids kicking off because they don't want to come. It's hard. But every choice you can make to prioritize church and church family now is a choice you will be eternally glad you made. And you can't say that of very many of your choices in a direct way. This lasts. The new creation is together. So does that mean that heaven is really about reunion? I mean, that's what the world thinks, isn't it? Recently, I was taking a burial service at a local cemetery. As I waited, I walked around and looked at some of the gravestones. And I think almost without exception, pretty much everyone had something like this on it. Until we meet again. Dearest Grandad, now reunited with Granny forever. And as the world writes that kind of stuff on their tombstones, they're not totally wrong. They're onto something. That desire we have for relationships, and therefore for those relationships to last beyond this brief life, that is a desire implanted in everyone by God. It's how we're wired. We're wired to live forever in relationships. So of course, people want to stick reunited stuff on their gravestones. Of course they do. And they're not totally wrong. For those who trust in Jesus, the new creation is a place of reuniting. You will see your Christian loved ones again. That is gloriously true. It is gloriously true. But the world does what it always does with any vaguely Christian idea they lay hold of. They strip the heart out of it. The world strips the heart out of heaven because they don't know the one that we are made to be reunited with. And so fourth and lastly, let's see this. The new creation is forever with God. The new creation is forever with God. Next slide, please. Thank you. Look at verse 7. The one who conquers will have this heritage, and I will be his God, and he will be my son. Who is the one who conquers in that verse? Well, to begin with, it's Jesus, isn't it? In Revelation, Jesus is the conquering king who defeats Satan and death and Hades. We just read about that last week in chapter 20. Back in chapter 3, Jesus himself says the same thing. He says, to the one who conquers, I will grant him to sit with me on my throne, as I also conquered and sat down with my Father on his throne. Jesus is the one who conquers in Revelation. He is the conqueror, but he shares his victory. He shares his conquering and his throne with his people. And in Revelation, what we're being urged to do is to stick with him, the conqueror, to resist the temptation to bail out on Jesus halfway through, to resist the pull to walk away from him, to stick with the conqueror, and then we will conquer too, and we get what he gets. That's the gospel in 5 words. We get what he gets. There you go. And this is why all the intimate language of this passage can be applied to you and me. I mean, doesn't that strike you as we heard it read by Michael? Didn't it strike you in Revelation 21 that there is very intimate language in terms of how close God is with his people? I think it's the dominant theme of this passage. Look at verse 2. We are a bride adorned for her husband. That is wedding day closeness. Verse 3. The dwelling place of God is with man. He's moving in with us. Verse 4. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Who will? God will, personally. He doesn't just issue the command from his throne and say, would someone please wipe all those tears away because there's no place for that here anymore. No. God himself, as it were, gets down on his knees and wipes the tears from your cheek like a dad would for his little girl. And all of this fits. All of this can be true and real for you because it's not really about you and me. Ultimately, it's about God and Jesus. This is Father-Son intimacy. But because in the gospel we can be in Jesus, suddenly their intimacy becomes ours too. The new creation is forever with Jesus. It's the reuniting that history has been moving towards from the very start. From the moment Adam and Eve were driven out of the Garden of Eden, out of God's presence, everything that's happened has been about one thing: getting God's people back together with God. In Egypt, God came after his people. In the wilderness, he drew closer to them in the tabernacle. In Isaiah, he promised that one day he would be fully with them. Emmanuel, God with us. In John's gospel, the word became flesh and tabernacled among us, but you had to be there to see him. At the end of Matthew's gospel, Jesus promised to be with us always, even to the end of the age, and he is by his Spirit, as we've seen this morning, but you can't see him. But finally, one day you will. You will be able to do what Thomas did at the end of John's gospel and put your hands into the holes in Jesus' wrists and sides. Verse 3 of our passage literally says this: God will tabernacle with them. All of biblical history, all the work of God through countless ages, building to this one moment, this one climax. This is the high point of heaven. God himself will be with them as their God. This is what makes heaven so good. This is what makes the new creation great. Finally, you get God. That is the big hope of the church, of people, of history. Finally, you can get God himself. No more suffering. That's going to be wonderful. Eternal life. That blows our brains. Ruling over creation is going to be awesome. New bodies. Yes, please, Lord. But none of it compares for 1 minute face to face with God. God is the high point of heaven. And our question as we end is this: is getting God, therefore, your big hope today? God tells us this stuff in the Bible about the future, not so we just know what's going to happen. There's loads of stuff that's going to happen that we don't know. Great stuff in the new creation that we don't find out about. God tells you this not to help you then. You don't need this then. You need it today. You need to see this now. How does heaven help us now? Above all, heaven helps us now by telling us more clearly than anything else what is best. And since hope in the Bible is the thing that pulls you through suffering, and since your suffering is big, you need the biggest hope possible. You need the biggest hope you can lay your hands on. And heaven tells you it's God himself. Hoping for heaven is wonderful. Hoping for God is better, bigger, stronger. And that hope is the one you need to pull you through, to keep you going, to make you conquer and overcome and last. And when I say hoping for God, if that feels too vague, if you're like, I don't know, I can't picture that, I don't know what that means, you don't have to. Remember this, the details of the new creation are a mystery to us. We don't know all that's going to be like. God has not told us everything because we don't need to know everything. But he has told us what we need to know today, and you already do know the heart of heaven. You already know the crowning glory of the new creation. You know God because you know Jesus. And so when you want to make this teaching work for you, when you're struggling to think about heaven because now is everything and it's messy and it's big, when you're struggling to think about heaven, think about him. When your future as a Christian feels fuzzy, focus on Jesus. When you don't know how to picture what's coming next, pick up your Bible and look again at him. When you need a hope that's worth holding on to, hold on to Christ. Pursue him, seek him, learn him, sing of him, speak of him, read of him. This life is short. It will soon be past. Our love for Jesus is what will last. Let me pray. Father, you tell us this not to give us information so we figure things out or know more, but to help us today when things are really difficult. So would you put heaven to work in our hearts now? Would you instill the new creation deep within us? Would you help us long for Jesus, long for face-to-face with him and all that comes with it? Would you expand and inflate that hope in us so that it can pull us through the pain of today to the place where pain will be no more because Jesus will be there face to face. Amen.